today with a focus on suspension. Now, suspension's a pet of mine, Steve. There are only 200 teaching days a year. Knock a couple of school development days out of that, a swimming carnival, a cross country, a bit of Starstruck, and the end of year play. And how many teaching days are left? Every one of those is highly precious, and sometimes things impact on that increasingly finite number. And so I know that's probably a good place to start our discussion today about suspension.
Absolutely, and it falls neatly under every child known, valued and cared for. James, you remember that we broke every child known, valued and cared for into the 4 categories. So we had attendance, suspension, well-being, and finally tell them from me. And today we're going to dive really heavily into suspension. We've made a very practical tool that schools can use to play along at home, and we're going to take you through a very quick guide. Now, we're going to start off initially going through Scout. What we'd suggest is that you download the resource pack that's sitting alongside this video. The initial bit just sets out the different components that we're going to look at. It does ask you to put the author in because we think it's important that the person or team that are doing this are recognised. So looking at Scout, we've got the different categories on the left hand side, and what we're suggesting is that the team go in, they screenshot the data, move it across into their resource pack. Now, some great information there, James. The number of suspensions on the left hand side, the percentage of students suspended on the right, total suspension days and average suspension length.
Categories, yep.
And we can spend a lot of time just analysing that. We put together a couple of inquiry questions. However, we'd really encourage teams, when you're looking at your own data, really think about your own lines of inquiry as well. So the very basic ones, we're going to look at which categories are ascending and which are in decline, and finally which categories require the most immediate attention. So moving on from the suspension overview, we really like the suspension scholastic year report because it can tell very different stories depending on the school, and this is just a sample school that we've stolen the data for. Again, number of suspensions up on the left hand side, total suspension days underneath. Suspensions per enrolled student's a really interesting figure, as is that average length of suspension. Again, we've come up with some inquiry questions. Which year group or which year groups are causing the most concern? Are there any programs currently being run to prevent suspension? And if so, are they having an impact? And particularly in a high school, there might be a program that targets a year group or a stage in a primary school. And it's really important to have a look and make some judgment calls.
So, Steve, I'm just looking here, and this might be a trap for young players. The 2020 data is year to date, isn't it?
Well, it is.
It's not dramatically lower than the 2019 data.
We also had a lot of time when students were learning from home, and
that's right.
As much as some parents may have wanted to suspend them, they weren't allowed. Now, if we look at the suspension by Aboriginality, I think this is a page that offers a real opportunity for us to really make some strong inquiry questions, but also look for how we can work with our local communities.
There is a real compelling case for stakeholder engagement in this process, in the situation analysis process. And I would say, starting with your local community and your AECG, this is a place where you need to start seeking patterns and discussing solutions.
I think it's really important to compare the percentage of Aboriginal students who are being suspended compared to the proportion they represent in the overall cohort. For many schools, and for too many schools, they will be overrepresented. We would ask you to look at the number of days that are lost this year for each student, but also for the last 2 or 3 years, and start to give consideration around what impact is that having on the literacy and numeracy for the students. Particularly if we're going to eliminate that disparity gap, we must address Aboriginal attendance, and suspension plays a huge part.
Sure.
That brings us to suspension by student, and there's a great Excel spreadsheet that this generates in Scout. Obviously, we can't remove all the names, so we've gone to Creative Commons and grabbed grabbed a few likely looking students. Looking at the students on your list, how many have multiple suspensions? How many days have they lost this year and how many have they lost in the last 3 years? What's the academic level of achievement of those students compared to their cohort? What proactive strategies are in place for those students? And finally, do those students have an identified or a suspected disability?
Steve, I would be suggesting those questions are examined at every single learning support team in every school, not just for your evaluation purposes, for your situational analysis.
Now, we're really happy to share with you what we call the ImpactEd triangle of success. We believe that for every child to be successful in our schools, there are 3 factors. The first is they need to be liked. They need to have friends within their cohort group, but they must feel that teachers like them and want them to be at school. They must experience success, and it's really important that students experience success every day, not just very occasionally. And finally, they need to have learning that's at their level, which takes us back to our inquiry question. What's the academic achievement level of those students? If they've had numerous long suspensions over the last 3 years, I guarantee that they'll be behind. And if we're not making quality intervention and adjustments for those students, there's no chance of them getting learning at their level. They won't experience success and they're going to go on that suspension merry-go-round.
So there's a lot of secondary data that needs to be examined here too, Steve. So, the level of differentiation in programming, the support team, learning support team, its functionality, and the case management and advocacy that's in place for various stakeholder groups within the school.
Yep. And I think this is a great opportunity, James, going through this process to now be looking at the QDAI. At the moment we're looking inward and we're collecting information, but we should be starting to ask questions that allow us to go and search for extra data, extra information to provide that secondary source.
So a bit of work to do there, Steve, beginning that journey of looking at that suspension data. Next week, we will start talking about some more practical tools, and in this case, focus groups. They've been around for years. Is there a new take on focus groups, Steve?
Well, I don't know so much that it's a new take, but we've got a how-to guide that we will release next week. And for example, to give an aspirant teacher the opportunity to run a focus group with these students that have multiple suspensions is a unique opportunity for a school to collect real evidence out of the mouths of babes.
All right. Well, I can't wait for that one. A tool I have used in many contexts for many years. So.
Yep. And then building on from there, I think the next one that we've got slated after that, James, is a matrix evaluation of well-being that will contribute to every child known, valued and cared for.
Love a good matrix, Steve, you know that.
Yeah. On that note, it's a good night from me.
And it's good night from him.